Amazon, the CEO got $213 million last year, and that was 6,474 times as much as median worker pay at the company, which was about 32,800.
Welcome to the Political Economy Project, with the goal of creating universal prosperity for today and future generations. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer for Empathy Media Lab that produces content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we are a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Sarah Anderson, who directs the Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and is a co-editor of the IPS website inequality.org. We'll be discussing a new report Sarah co-authored titled Executive Excess 2022. The CEOs at America's largest low-wage employers are grabbing huge raises while workers and consumers struggle with rising costs. Sarah, thanks so much for your time.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So let's go right into the report. What are some of the key findings from your research?
Well, we do this report every year on executive excess, the gaps between CEO and worker pay. And this year, we wanted to get a picture of corporate pay practices during the pandemic. You know, there's been so much talk about how low-wage workers have gotten raises. And so we focused in on the 300 US corporations that have the lowest median worker pay. And what we found is that at more than a third of these companies, worker pay did not even keep pace with inflation. And overall, the gaps between CEO and worker pay rose to about 670 to 1, which was up from 604 to 1 the year before. And so I guess our overall key finding is that even though some low-wage workers did get a bit of a pay increase last year, in most cases, it didn't keep pace with inflation, and CEO pay, meanwhile, totally skyrocketed.
And this is incredibly offensive, obviously, when we've just gone through this pandemic and you see the billionaires have increased their wealth by trillions of dollars. Could you talk about the stock buybacks that help inflate the price of the stocks?
Yeah, well, we zeroed in on these companies where worker pay did not keep pace with inflation. And we asked the question, well, was that just because they just didn't have enough cash to put into these wage increases? And instead, what we found is that more than two-thirds of them had blown company resources buying back their own stock instead of doing things like raising worker pay or other things that would help the company in the long term, like research and development or training or buying new equipment. And why do they do this? Well, when you buy up a bunch of your own stock from the open market, it artificially inflates the value of it. And that inflates the value of CEO pay because they get most of their compensation in some form of stock-based pay. So it makes CEOs happy, it makes wealthy shareholders happy, but stock buybacks do absolutely nothing for ordinary workers.
Yeah, and it actually parasitizes these corporations from actually achieving long-term functionality and growth at the short-term expense of everyone else. And so one of the things that was also really interesting was how much federal government spending is supporting a lot of these corporations. Could you talk about what that relationship may be with some of these companies?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is outrageous enough, but then when you think about how we as taxpayers are actually enabling and supporting a lot of these companies, it just makes your blood boil even more. And so in our sample of 300 low-wage corporations, 40% of them are federal contractors. So they're getting taxpayer dollars through contracts to perform various services or provide goods to the government. And in many of these cases, the behavior of these corporations is nothing that we should be supporting. And maybe I'll give a couple of examples. One is Amazon, which, you know, I don't have to say a whole lot about their treatment of workers and the union busting that they're doing right now. And people don't think of Amazon as a major contractor, but they are. They got it more than $10 billion worth of contracts from the Defense Department to provide web services. And there's more money they're getting from the CIA in places where we don't even know the details because it's classified. And then another company that we've been lifting up a lot is Maximus. This is a company that gets billions and billions of dollars from the federal government to run call centers for Medicare and Obamacare, for example. And they're a low wage company. In fact, before Biden passed an executive order requiring contractors to pay at least $15 an hour, a lot of these workers were making $10 and change per hour. And they have been trying to organize a union at their plants in the South, in Mississippi and Louisiana. It's largely Black female workforce at these facilities. And the company, like Amazon, undercutting the union. And meanwhile, these workers have been doing walkouts to demand better pay and health benefits. Some of them are answering questions for their job about Obamacare, and they can't even afford health insurance themselves. And so I think, when people know about this, that I haven't even talked about the CEO pay gap at Amazon. How could I forget? At Amazon, the CEO got $213 million last year, and that was 6,474 times as much as median worker pay at the company, which was about 32,800. And at Maximus as well, the CEO made about $8 million last year, and median worker pay was in the 30 something thousand range. And so, here we are as taxpayers, and across the political spectrum, people are outraged about these huge gaps between CEO and worker pay, and yet we're enabling them through our taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, and there's how many hundreds of thousands of Amazon workers that are also getting government subsidies on food and healthcare that we're
Gosh.
also providing on the other end of that as well. And
Double dipping or
yeah,
double dipping in the government, coffers by getting contracts and also paying their workers so little that they have to rely on government assistance.
and could you talk about the CEO ratio pay? What are some historic examples of a more equitable ratio?
Yeah, well, back in 1980, the typical gap between CEO and worker pay was about 40 to 1. Now it's several hundred times to 1. And there's no argument that changes because CEOs have just gotten so much smarter and they perform so much better. It's a total joke that we have a pay for performance system when it comes to CEO pay. In fact, we cite a study in the report that looked at CEOs who were in their job like over the last decade or so. They looked at several hundred CEOs, and the ones where the companies performed the best had the lowest paid CEOs. So it's like there's a inverse correlation, or however you put it, between CEO pay and performance. And, why does it persist? It's, largely because corporate boards have bought into this view that it's the guy in the corner office who's almost single-handedly responsible for the value of a company, which we always knew was nonsense. But after 2 years of a pandemic, when so many low-wage workers have been on the front lines, really keeping our economy going, helping to keep people safe, helping to keep food on families' tables. It's just, ridiculous to argue that these people are not contributing, substantially, significantly to the value of their companies, and they should be getting a fair reward. But these corporate boards, often they're made up of other executives from other companies who don't like to rock the boat. And in terms of government policy, we've allowed them to get away with it.
Yeah, the billionaire cult of personality, the great man or whatever
The
you
great
want to
man
call it.
theory.
Yeah, that these people single-handedly are, genius in creating all this value,
Uh,
and it completely obscures all
yeah.
the hands that have
Let,
made it. Yeah,
let me just tell one more story about
please.
that because I just can't get over this. Carnival, the cruise company, in 2020, they were, in facing complete crisis, right? All the cruise companies were. And at a point when, their industry was shut down, they still had employees stranded literally in the ocean, like on ships. They had not gotten these people home to safety. And what was the corporate board focused on at that moment? They were figuring out how to concoct a special pandemic bonus retention grant for their CEO. Because in their mind, like if that guy left, the whole thing would, fall apart. They had to do whatever they could to to retain this CEO. Well, they had employees stranded in the middle of the ocean. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but it's so preposterous. And the punchline here is they spent all this money retaining this guy. But what did he do? He left the company in 2021. So, the idea that you just have to beg and grovel and, keep this so-called top talent when these often are the most disloyal people who will walk away in a crisis unless you pay them, these ridiculous sums.
Well, I want to talk a bit about policy solutions, policy demands, and also going into media and agitation, which you've been doing the tremendous work over the last couple decades, and then how we can organize to actually make this happen. So you do go through some policy solutions. Could you share that with the audience?
Yeah, well, the solutions are kind of in a couple of different buckets. One is legislative, and then there's what could President Biden do without having to wait around for Congress. And all of this, I feel like, should be in sync with the good work being done by shareholder activists. There's great work around the Amazon annual meeting and so forth, but I'm fo- primarily focused on policy. So I'll talk about that. For years now, we've been pushing the idea of using the tax code to incentivize companies to reduce CEO pay and lift up worker pay. Senator Sanders and Warren and a bunch of others on the House side have introduced a bill called the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act. And under this bill, the wider your gap between CEO and worker pay, the higher your corporate tax rate would be. And so this general idea, well, it's already enforced in a couple cities in the US, in Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco. They both have taxes like this that penalize companies that have big gaps between CEO and worker pay. And it applies to not just companies based in those cities, but companies that do business there. So the Walmarts, the Wells Fargos, these big companies are all paying those kinds of taxes in those cities. We could have that at the federal level. And it did come into the discussion around the Build Back Better Act and how to pay for it. So it's not just, out there a fringe idea. Has become much more in the center of the debate. But with the gridlock in Congress, we're thinking more and more about what could President Biden do. And he has already done some good things in terms of putting conditions on government contractors, like requiring them to have a $15 minimum. But we think the pay gap is also really a big problem. And there are many more things he could do that would be good for workers. So, for example, he could require them to sign neutrality agreements in union organizing campaigns. He could give companies that have narrow gaps between CEO and worker pay a leg up in contracting in the same way that we give some preferential treatment to companies that are small businesses headed by women and people of color and things like that, which are aimed at leveling the playing field. We could take that same concept and apply it to big corporations and encourage them to have narrower pay gaps. We could also require them to have workers on boards or give them extra points in contracting competition if they have worker representatives on their boards. So there's a whole bunch of tools that the president does have that I think would be wildly popular. There are polls that have come out recently that show 87% of Americans think the pay gap is a problem for the nation. It's not just a worker issue, it's like a concern for all of us. And the most startling survey finding, even for somebody like me, is that 65% of Republicans support a cap on CEO pay relative to worker pay. So
Those
um,
socialists, those damn
it's
socialists,
it's so much more radical than what I've been talking about, which is just using tax incentives, using contracting incentives. They just want to put a ceiling on it. And, a much higher share of Democrats support that point of view. So I think it would be wildly popular. Also, urging companies that will likely be more productive because the extreme gaps we have in pay now are demoralizing for people at the bottom. And that contributes to higher turnover rates, which are very, expensive to deal with, especially in a time like this with a tight labor market. And so I'm hoping that the administration will seriously consider that instead of, they propose some good things that Capitol Hill should do, but he doesn't have to wait around for Joe Manchin or anybody else to take
yeah.
action on these things. There's a lot he could do to use the power of the public purse to push companies in a more equitable direction.
Yeah, I keep thinking about the trickle down economics and how it's been disproven again and again and again, and yet we see it in under Trump in 2017, where he does the largest tax cut in history, 1.3 trillion dollars. And people on the side of the titans, I guess, they make the argument that, well, this is going to generate business, but it's been shown again and again that the
Right.
rich will buy luxury goods with it, move it offshore. They never reinvest it into plants and equipment and into labor and into R&D as well. And even the stock buybacks, there used to be restrictions before 1982, and you mentioned
Right.
this in the report that federal regulators considered buybacks a form of stock manipulation, banned them, which it clearly is a form of stock manipulation,
Yeah.
which is why we see Wall Street and the S&P and Dow Jones are through the roof, and now they're starting to deflate again because there was a huge bubble. How do we get more of the workers to understand these things so that they can start demanding it within the companies, because they all ultimately are going to be the folks who move these companies, move the politicians to demand these things, and they can shut down these companies if they can just get to a point where they are organized enough and they're all singing from the same sheet of music that this is just unacceptable. And it's not that the company has to even change its business practices. It just has to move the funds so that the people who are creating so much of the wealth are given some of it. And I know you've been doing tremendous service the last many years reporting on this, and IPS is doing great work, and inequality.org as well. But how do we spread out the organizing message?
Well, as frustrating as it all is, I do think this is a moment of hopefulness. I mean, when you have the surge of unionization efforts at places like Starbucks and Amazon, and in very, unusual places like Mississippi and Alabama, the anti-union kind of stronghold parts of the country, and you're seeing workers rising up and talking about how much their bosses are making compared to what they're making and demanding their fair share. I do think it is a moment of hopefulness that we need to absolutely make the most of. And I think we need to connect that energy on the ground to the policy debates as well. The more that we can bring workers in motion into, the halls of Congress and into meetings with the administration, and really, and not just, you know, expecting companies to do things voluntarily on their own that are pro worker, but have the government really have their backs. It would be in the interest of these workers and in the interest of the whole country. I mean, I think we never want to be in a position like we were in 2020 again, where such a massive share of our population was so close to the financial edge when a huge crisis hit that, it didn't take that much to push them over and have to rely on government assistance. And so if we want to be in a much stronger position in the face of future crises, we need to address these pay disparities. We need to make sure that, it's possible to get decent pay and benefits so that you're more resilient. And so I think the more that we can broaden this movement around unionization to be something that's good for the entire country and would be good for our economic health in general, the more people are going to be even more sympathetic. I mean, it is remarkable to see the public support for these unionization drives, but I think it could be even broader if we make the message not just about the demands of these workers for a fair reward for themselves and their families, but how this is really going to make our whole economy more healthy.
And as I was discussing before we started recording, I just came back from the AFL-CIO convention, Philadelphia, and Labor Notes conference in Chicago. And in the report that we're talking about today, that I'm going to put in the show notes and everyone should check out and read, you do a great job in really bringing the information together in very succinct pieces. And are you in touch with the AFL-CIO? Are you in touch with folks from Labor Notes, different labor organizations, so that they can look at the information on the pay gap and these crazy ratios, but then specifically within the companies that maybe they're trying to organize or that there already are unions?
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm very close allies with a lot of the labor groups, and everyone should know about on the AFL-CIO website. I think the most popular part of the site is called Paywatch, and that's where they compile all of their CEO and worker data. And I think you can go on there and like type in your own pay level and find out how much more times, the CEO of your company or other companies are making than you. They'll be relaunching the new version of that later this month, I believe, or maybe early July. But I work really hand in hand with the champions against excessive CEO pay at a lot of the unions, and am really proud to be part of broader coalitions that involve folks trying to organize at Amazon and Starbucks and elsewhere. We're gonna need everything,
Yeah.
every, source of energy and resources to throw at a situation where the other side is so formidable. We all know what kind of money is arrayed against us. And so we really need the worker organizing, the shareholder organizing, the policy work, the pressure on the administration. We need all of it.
And while I have you here, could you talk a little bit about inequality.org and how that came together and how people can interact with that as well?
Yeah. So I work for the Institute for Policy Studies, and we have this site called inequality.org that is a go to place for facts and figures on inequality, as well as ideas on solutions and inspiring profiles of people who are fighting inequality. And we have a free weekly newsletter that you can sign up for on our website homepage that I think is essential reading every week to know what's going on. And we call it the horror, the hope, and the humor related to our extreme inequality.
Great. And you also just spoke at the Poor People's Campaign. What do you hope can come from that, from the Poor People's March on Washington that just took place this past weekend?
Yeah, thanks for raising that because this is an effort to build a multiracial fusion movement led by the poor and low wage workers. And so it is a powerful combination of forces that has come together addressing the interconnected injustices of systemic racism, poverty and inequality, ecological devastation and militarism. And so it, covers all these interconnected issues. It is, very much driven by the people most affected by our current system, and it's big and bold and loud, and they are mobilizing low income and low wage people to get engaged in the election and make sure that their issues and their voices are heard by the candidates, and they make a really compelling case. They've got the numbers to back it up that the voter block of the poor could be definitely the deciding voting block in this country. And to get them out there, more candidates need to speak to their issues. So for us, it's been a really inspiring partnership. We do a lot of research support for the campaign, and it's been great to watch them grow. And there were lots of labor luminaries on the stage. Sarah Nelson from the Flight Attendants Union, Mary Kay Henry from SEIU, workers from Bucks and Dollar General and other places. So it's a great partnership between groups that have primarily focused on anti-poverty measures with the labor movement.
Well, I'm gonna just want to ask you one final question as we're heading out. What gives you hope? What gives you motivation? What gets you out of bed every day? And how does that help? And how can that maybe give motivation to other people?
I think what gets me out of bed every day is knowing how powerful the other side is, and that we've all got to get out of bed every day ready to fight and make the most of the resources that we do have, because otherwise they're really gonna, keep rolling over ordinary people in the society. And I feel that is deeply wrong. And I'm so motivated by, like I said, the surge of unionization. I've got to meet some of the young Starbucks organizers and people, standing up to Amazon, the most powerful company in the world probably right now. And I realize even when I think my job is hard, I think about the work that they're doing. And I'm reminded about how much harder it is to do the kind of organizing work they're doing. And so if they can do it, I should be able to get out of bed and do my job as well.
Well, Sarah Anderson, thank you for all that you're doing, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.